The cruelest betrayals are not the ones that end your life. They are the ones that convince you your love was never worth saving. The cold mountain wind tugged at Rosalie Whitmore's long golden brown hair as she stood upon the ancient stone platform overlooking the kingdom she had once called home. Gray clouds swallowed the afternoon sky until the world seemed drained of every color except the crimson banners bearing the royal crest of Ashford. Hundreds of voices gathered beyond the castle courtyard, yet none of them reached her heart anymore. Their whispers had once wounded her. Today they were only echoes fading into silence. They called her a traitor. They called her the rejected Omega who had dared to betray her Alpha King. No one cared that she had spent years protecting a kingdom that never protected her. No one cared that every accusation had been built upon carefully crafted lies. High above the crowd, Alpha King Damien Ashford stood beneath the royal canopy, dressed in black armor that gleamed beneath the dim light, his heavy crimson cloak flowing behind him like the last flame before winter. His broad shoulders remained perfectly still, his sharp features unreadable from where she stood. Once, Rosalie would have searched his face for even the smallest sign of doubt. Once, she would have believed the invisible thread between their souls would guide him back to her. But hope had become the cruelest prison of all. Deep inside her chest, the mate bond pulsed one final time, fragile and aching, like a candle struggling against a storm. Her wolf whimpered softly, not from fear, but from heartbreak. She had spent years believing destiny could never be wrong. Fate, everyone said, always chose correctly. Yet fate had chosen a king who never truly saw her. Memories flooded through her mind with painful clarity. She remembered the quiet mornings when she secretly stitched torn cloaks for palace guards because no one else noticed they needed warmth. She remembered skipping meals so orphan children hiding near the outer village walls would have enough bread to last another day. She remembered every stolen glance toward Damien during royal ceremonies, convincing herself that one day he would finally look back with recognition instead of polite indifference. She remembered Lady Seraphine's sweet smile that always disappeared the moment no one else was watching. Every warning had been hidden beneath kindness. Every trap had been wrapped in courtesy. Rosalie closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. If she regretted anything, it was not loving Damien. It was believing love alone could overcome deception. Somewhere across the courtyard, church bells rang slowly, each note heavier than the last. The kingdom believed justice was about to be served. Only Rosalie knew the truth. Justice had vanished long before this day. A quiet tear escaped despite her determination not to cry. It traced her cheek before disappearing into the cold breeze. She refused to let bitterness be the final thing her heart carried. Even now, she silently wished that someday Damien would discover what had truly happened, not for revenge, but so he would never make the same mistake again. The royal decree was read aloud, though the words blended into distant noise. Rosalie barely listened. Instead, she lifted her eyes toward the endless gray sky. Strange. She had expected terror. Instead she felt exhausted, as though years of carrying hope had become far heavier than losing it. Then something impossible happened. The mate bond shattered. Not with pain alone, but with a brilliant flash that no one else seemed able to see. Time itself appeared to hesitate. The cold air became warm. The bells stopped ringing mid-note. Every sound dissolved into complete silence. Rosalie gasped as blinding silver light surrounded her, pulling her away from the lonely stone platform, away from the accusing voices, away from the life she had failed to save. She opened her eyes with a sharp breath and found herself sitting upright inside her modest room in the palace servants' quarters. Morning sunlight poured through the small window. Birds sang outside as though nothing terrible had ever happened. Her heartbeat thundered against her ribs. The simple blue-gray dress folded neatly beside her bed. The faded wooden chair. The tiny vase holding fresh wildflowers she had gathered. Herself. Every detail belonged to a day she remembered with terrifying certainty. 3 months before the royal mating ceremony. 3 months before every lie began closing around her. Trembling, she rushed toward the small mirror hanging beside the door. The frightened young woman staring back had no scars of sorrow upon her face yet, only wide emerald eyes filled with impossible understanding. She slowly touched her own reflection, tears gathering once more. "I'm alive," she whispered, her voice breaking beneath the weight of a miracle she had never dared imagine. Outside, palace bells announced the beginning of another ordinary morning. But nothing would ever be ordinary again. Rosalie drew a slow breath, steadied her trembling hands, and looked directly into her own eyes. "This time," she said quietly, "before fate has the chance to abandon me, I will be the one who walks away first." Rosalie Whitmore stepped away from the mirror as the morning bells echoed across the palace grounds, each familiar note carrying a meaning entirely different from the one it had held in her first life. 3 months. That was all fate had given her to rewrite an ending carved into memory. She closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe slowly until the trembling in her hands faded. Panic had nearly destroyed her once before. This time, calm would become her greatest weapon. She reached for the simple blue-gray dress folded neatly beside her bed, smoothing every wrinkle as though restoring order to the fabric could somehow restore order to her heart. Outside, servants hurried across the stone courtyard carrying baskets of fresh bread and flowers for the upcoming Harvest Moon Festival. Their cheerful conversations sounded almost unreal. They had no idea that in another lifetime many of them would mourn a tragedy they never understood. As Rosalie stepped into the hallway, familiar faces greeted her with polite smiles. She returned every greeting warmly, surprising herself with how naturally she could still be kind. The past had taught her caution, not cruelty. Every person she passed became another reminder that she had not returned to punish the innocent. She had returned to protect the life she almost lost. Her first destination was not the royal gardens where she would once wait for a chance encounter with Damien Ashford. Instead, she quietly walked toward the old chapel hidden behind the eastern courtyard, a place few nobles ever visited unless duty required it. The elderly caretaker looked up with gentle surprise as she entered. "You are here early today, Miss Whitmore," he said kindly. Rosalie smiled with quiet gratitude. "I came to ask about an ancient ceremony," she replied. "One that severs a sacred bond before it is completed." The old man studied her face carefully, sensing a sadness beyond her years. After a long silence, he led her toward a shelf filled with weathered books untouched by most of the kingdom. His trembling fingers rested upon a faded leather volume marked with the symbol of the moon goddess. "Very few seek this knowledge," he whispered. "Most believe destiny should never be questioned." Rosalie gently accepted the book, her heartbeat quickening. She already knew what destiny had cost her. She would not surrender to it again. Hidden within brittle pages she found the forgotten ritual. It required no violence, no revenge, only unwavering resolve. Before the sacred bond was fully sealed during the royal ceremony, an Omega could willingly release her claim beneath the first full moon by offering her own promise to walk a different path. Few had ever chosen such loneliness. Fewer still had succeeded. She traced the faded words with careful fingers until they blurred beneath gathering tears. Freedom had a price, but so did blind devotion. She chose freedom. As she left the chapel with the ancient book hidden beneath her cloak, another presence entered the courtyard from the opposite side of the palace. Damien Ashford had returned unexpectedly from inspecting the northern border earlier than anyone anticipated. Palace guards straightened immediately as the Alpha King crossed the marble steps in polished black armor, his crimson cloak moving behind him with quiet authority. He acknowledged greetings with practiced composure, yet something unsettled him without explanation. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath the calm surface of his mind. It was not pain. Not yet. It was a strange pull, as though someone who had always moved toward him had suddenly chosen another direction. Without thinking, Damien slowed his pace and looked across the courtyard just as Rosalie disappeared beyond an archway without ever lifting her eyes toward him. He frowned almost imperceptibly. Every previous encounter he could remember had ended with the gentle Omega offering him a respectful smile. Today she walked away as though he had never existed. The feeling lingered long after she vanished from sight. It was insignificant, he told himself. A simple coincidence. Yet his wolf refused to settle, pacing silently inside him with growing unease. Meanwhile, Rosalie stepped into the quiet streets beyond the palace walls, the ancient book held close against her heart. For the first time since opening her eyes in this second life, she felt the smallest spark of hope. She was no longer waiting for destiny to choose her. She had already begun choosing herself. The following morning arrived wrapped in silver mist that drifted through the towering pines surrounding the royal capital, softening the outlines of stone walls that had once felt like the safest place in Rosalie Whitmore's world. Now every familiar path reminded her that even beautiful places could hide painful truths. She kept the ancient leather-bound book concealed beneath a folded shawl inside her small wardrobe, returning to its fragile pages only after sunset when no curious eyes lingered outside her window. Every passage she memorized strengthened her resolve. The ritual would require patience, unwavering conviction, and one final decision beneath the next full moon. Until then, she had to survive without drawing attention. That proved far more difficult than she expected. Throughout the palace, preparations for the Harvest Moon Festival filled every corridor with excitement. Noble families arrived in polished carriages, merchants displayed colorful fabrics imported from distant kingdoms, and musicians rehearsed cheerful melodies that echoed across the marble courtyards. Rosalie quietly volunteered to assist the palace healers rather than join the festivities. Organizing herbs, preparing clean bandages, and comforting exhausted workers gave her mind something useful to hold onto instead of memories she wished she could silence. Yet destiny seemed strangely unwilling to release its grip. Late that afternoon, while carrying a basket of fresh lavender toward the royal infirmary, she turned a corner and nearly walked directly into Damien Ashford. Time seemed to pause for a heartbeat. The Alpha King stood only a few feet away, sunlight reflecting across the dark metal of his ceremonial armor. His long black hair rested neatly over his shoulders, and his calm gray eyes met hers with polite surprise. In her first life, this unexpected encounter had become one of the happiest memories she carried. She had smiled so brightly that day, convinced fate itself had guided her toward him. Now her heart reacted very differently. Old sorrow rose first, followed by quiet determination. She lowered her gaze respectfully, stepped to the side, and spoke with steady composure. "Your Majesty." Before Damien could answer, she continued walking without hesitation. No lingering glance. No hopeful smile. No silent prayer that he might ask her to stay. The entire exchange lasted only seconds, yet it left an invisible emptiness hanging in the air after she disappeared down the corridor. Damien remained motionless longer than he intended. Something felt profoundly wrong, though he could not explain why. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath his composed expression, pushing against instincts that had never questioned anything before. "Follow her," the silent voice urged. "Make sure she is safe. Speak to her again." Damien frowned almost imperceptibly. The impulse made no sense. He barely knew Rosalie Whitmore beyond polite greetings during palace events. She was simply a kind young Omega respected by servants for her generosity. Why would his wolf react as though someone precious had slipped beyond reach? He dismissed the feeling and continued toward the council chamber, yet the unease refused to disappear. During the afternoon meeting, reports from border patrols and trade negotiations blurred together. More than once, Damien caught himself staring absently through the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. Each time, his wolf searched for the same quiet presence that had already walked away. Across the palace grounds, Rosalie felt an unexpected ache pulse briefly inside her chest before fading again. The unfinished mate bond was reacting. She recognized the sensation immediately because she had lived with it for years before her first death. This time she refused to let it control her. She pressed one hand lightly against her heart, closed her eyes, and whispered the ancient promise she had memorized from the forgotten ritual. "My soul belongs first to truth, then to destiny." The pain eased almost instantly. Hidden beneath the shade of an old oak tree nearby, another pair of watchful eyes witnessed everything. Lady Seraphine Blackwell lowered the embroidered fan that partially concealed her face, her pleasant smile never wavering. She had noticed Rosalie's unusual behavior for several days now. The shy Omega who once revolved quietly around the Alpha King no longer sought even the smallest opportunity to remain near him. More troubling still, Damien himself had begun glancing toward Rosalie far more often than before. Seraphine's elegant smile grew slightly colder as an unfamiliar sense of caution settled into her thoughts. Something had changed. She did not know what had awakened this new version of Rosalie Whitmore, but instinct warned her that the future she had carefully arranged was beginning to shift in ways she could no longer predict. Before the sun climbed above the eastern hills, Rosalie Whitmore was already awake, standing beside the narrow window of her modest room as pale morning light stretched across the palace gardens. She had spent most of the night studying the ancient ritual until every line had settled into her memory. Yet one passage refused to leave her thoughts. It spoke of an invisible law older than every kingdom, declaring that when one soul truly rejected a destined future, the world itself would begin searching for a different path. At first, Rosalie had believed those words were only poetic symbolism. Now she wondered if they had been a warning. After finishing her morning duties, she carried fresh herbs toward the western greenhouse, taking the quieter path beside the crystal fountain. In her previous life, this very morning had ended in disaster. A frightened stable horse had broken free during festival preparations, charging across the courtyard and sending a young servant tumbling down the marble staircase. Rosalie remembered every detail because she had rushed forward to help while most nobles watched from a safe distance. The accident had delayed preparations for days and later became one of the countless excuses Seraphine used to question the competence of the palace staff. Rosalie slowed her steps as she approached the familiar courtyard. Her heartbeat quickened. The memory felt as vivid as if it were unfolding again. She glanced toward the stable entrance and instinctively began walking faster. Moments later she noticed one of the stable boys struggling to secure the nervous horse exactly as before. Without stopping to question herself, she gently placed the basket of herbs on the fountain ledge and crossed the courtyard. Her calm voice reached the frightened animal before panic could spread. She spoke softly, offering the horse a fresh apple she had tucked into her apron earlier that morning. Within seconds, the restless animal lowered its head, allowing the young stable hand to fasten the reins securely. The courtyard remained peaceful. No frightened screams echoed through the palace. No servant fell upon the cold stone steps. No chaos interrupted the festival preparations. Rosalie stood perfectly still as realization settled over her. The future had changed. Not because fate had decided differently, but because she had. A quiet warmth filled her chest, replacing the helplessness that had haunted her since awakening in this second life. One choice had rewritten an entire day. If something so small could alter destiny, perhaps something much greater could also be saved. Unseen from the balcony above, Lady Seraphine Blackwell watched the entire scene unfold with growing disbelief. She distinctly remembered hearing reports of a serious accident during this same festival in years past. The strange certainty had always lingered in the back of her mind like the memory of a dream she could never fully explain. Yet the accident never happened. Instead, Rosalie had prevented it before anyone else realized danger existed. Seraphine's fingers tightened around the carved stone railing. Coincidence rarely repeated itself. Instinct whispered that Rosalie was no longer reacting to events. She was anticipating them. That possibility sent an unfamiliar chill through Seraphine's carefully controlled confidence. Meanwhile, inside the royal council chamber, Damien Ashford abruptly paused in the middle of reviewing military reports. A sharp ache spread through his chest before disappearing almost as quickly as it came. His advisors exchanged puzzled glances as the Alpha King stared toward the palace windows with distant eyes. His wolf had become restless again, stronger than before, urging him toward the western courtyard without reason. Damien dismissed the meeting earlier than usual and walked alone through the palace grounds, unable to explain the growing sense that something important had shifted beyond his sight. As he reached the crystal fountain, he noticed servants laughing together while festival decorations fluttered peacefully overhead. Gideon Mercer approached with a respectful bow before quietly remarking, "It is fortunate Miss Whitmore happened to be nearby this morning." Her quick thinking prevented what could have become a terrible accident. Damien looked toward the stable where workers continued their tasks as though nothing unusual had happened. "Miss Whitmore, he repeated almost absent-mindedly. Gideon nodded. She seemed to know exactly what to do before anyone else understood there was a problem. Damien remained silent, but his wolf stirred with unmistakable certainty. Somewhere deep inside, beyond memory and beyond reason, an impossible thought brushed against his heart. It felt as though Rosalie was walking a path she had somehow traveled before, and with every quiet decision she made, the distance between the future he expected and the future now unfolding continued to grow. Moonlight washed the royal capital in pale silver as the Harvest Moon Festival slowly faded into quiet conversation and distant music, but Rosalie Whitmore did not join the celebration. Instead, she climbed the narrow path leading toward the abandoned moon shrine hidden beyond the northern forest, the ancient leather-bound book wrapped carefully beneath her cloak. Every step felt heavier than the last because she knew there would be no turning back once the ritual began. The forgotten sanctuary stood exactly as she remembered from the brittle drawings inside the old manuscript, its weathered stone pillars reaching toward the stars while vines covered symbols so ancient that few people in the kingdom could still recognize them. The air itself seemed different there, calmer, untouched by ambition or pride. Rosalie knelt before the circular altar and carefully opened the book to the final page. The words no longer frightened her. They offered neither revenge nor escape. They offered only freedom earned through sacrifice. She closed her eyes and whispered each ancient promise with unwavering clarity. She released the dreams she had built around a future that no longer belonged to her. She released the silent hope that Damien Ashford would someday become the man she had once believed he already was. Most painfully of all, she released the version of herself who had measured her worth through someone else's acceptance. As the final vow left her lips, a gentle breeze swept across the shrine although the surrounding trees remained perfectly still. Soft silver light gathered around the weathered altar before slowly surrounding her like quiet moonlit mist. Deep within her heart, the unfinished mate bond trembled. It did not shatter with violence or anger. Instead, it unraveled like a delicate thread that had been stretched too tightly for too long. Rosalie pressed one trembling hand against her chest as warm tears slipped down her face. The pain surprised her, not because it was unbearable, but because it carried years of unspoken love leaving her soul all at once. She allowed herself to cry without shame. She was not mourning Damien alone. She was mourning the future she had dreamed about since she was a young girl. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ache disappeared. Silence settled over the shrine. For the first time in both of her lives, her heart felt entirely her own. At that exact moment, miles away inside the royal palace, Damien stopped abruptly while crossing the eastern gallery with Gideon Mercer. An invisible force swept through him so suddenly that he instinctively reached for the stone wall beside him. His breathing became uneven as an unfamiliar emptiness spread across his chest. His wolf, usually calm and disciplined, let out a long, mournful cry that echoed through his thoughts with heartbreaking clarity. Something precious had vanished. Something it had always believed would one day become part of them had slipped beyond its reach. Gideon immediately stepped closer. "Your Majesty, are you feeling unwell?" Damien slowly straightened, struggling to understand what had happened. "No," he answered after a long silence, though even he did not believe the word. His eyes drifted instinctively toward the northern mountains where the full moon hung above the dark forest. An overwhelming urge pulled at him with impossible strength, begging him to go there immediately. He had no explanation for it. Only certainty. Meanwhile, hidden within the shadows of another palace balcony, Lady Seraphine Blackwell watched the Alpha King's unusual reaction with growing alarm. She had spent years studying every expression Damien allowed himself to reveal. Tonight, for the first time, genuine confusion crossed his face. Before she could consider what it meant, a sudden wave of icy unease passed through her own body. It lasted only an instant, yet it felt as though countless invisible threads she had carefully woven around the future had begun slipping loose one after another. Far above the kingdom, clouds slowly drifted away from the full moon, revealing its brilliant light across the forest, the palace, and the forgotten shrine alike. Rosalie rose from the ancient altar with quiet determination, gently closing the weathered book before placing one hand over her peaceful heart. The bond that had once defined her destiny no longer existed. She had chosen herself before fate could abandon her again. But somewhere beyond the silent trees, another destiny had just awakened, and neither she nor Damien yet understood the price the changing timeline would soon demand. The morning after the full moon carried an unfamiliar stillness across the kingdom, as though the world itself had paused to acknowledge that something ancient had quietly come to an end. Rosalie Whitmore woke before dawn, expecting to feel the lingering emptiness left behind by the broken mate bond. Instead, she discovered something she had never experienced in either lifetime. Peace. The constant ache beneath her ribs had vanished completely. For years she had mistaken that quiet longing for love itself, believing every heartbeat belonged to a destiny that would eventually reward her patience. Now she realized how much of her life had been spent waiting instead of living. She opened the small window beside her bed and welcomed the crisp mountain air into her room. The sunrise painted the distant hills with gentle shades of gold, reminding her that every morning was simply another chance to choose differently. She smiled, not because every danger had disappeared, but because she no longer feared facing tomorrow alone. After completing her morning duties, Rosalie returned to the old chapel where the elderly caretaker carefully accepted the ancient leather-bound book with grateful hands. He studied her face for several quiet moments before speaking softly. "You look lighter than when you first arrived." Rosalie lowered her eyes with a peaceful smile. "Some burdens cannot be carried forever," she answered. The old man nodded as though he understood far more than she had said aloud. Before she left, he reached beneath the altar and produced a small wooden box covered in faded carvings of wolves beneath a crescent moon. Inside rested a silver pendant shaped like a single moonflower blossom. "This belonged to one of the last moon keepers," he explained. She believed true courage was not found in holding tightly to destiny, but in having the strength to release it. Rosalie accepted the pendant with quiet gratitude, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through her fingertips the moment she touched it. Somewhere within her memory, another forgotten image flickered into view. In her previous life, she had never seen this pendant. She had never returned the ancient book. She had never spoken to the caretaker after that first visit. Another piece of the future had changed. As she stepped outside the chapel, the memory lingered just long enough for another realization to emerge. If this path had never existed before, then neither she nor anyone else could predict what awaited ahead. For the first time since awakening in her second life, uncertainty no longer frightened her. It felt like freedom. Across the palace, Damien Ashford stood alone inside the royal archives, surrounded by shelves filled with generations of forgotten history. Sleep had abandoned him completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the same impossible emptiness spreading through his chest, accompanied by the distant echo of a sorrow he could not name. He had searched military reports, diplomatic records, and even old accounts describing the sacred bond between Alpha and Omega, hoping to understand the unsettling change within himself. Nothing explained why his wolf remained restless despite the kingdom enjoying complete peace. Gideon Mercer entered quietly, carrying several aging ledgers requested by the king. "These are the oldest ceremonial records we could locate," he said respectfully. Damien thanked him before opening the first volume. Hours passed as he examined faded pages describing royal traditions that had long been forgotten. Near the back of one weathered journal, a single handwritten note caught his attention. It spoke of an unfinished mate bond that could disappear forever if one destined soul willingly surrendered its claim before the sacred union was completed. Damien read the passage twice. Then a third time. A strange heaviness settled over him as though the words had awakened something buried deep inside his heart. Before he could consider the meaning further, Gideon noticed another folded document tucked between the brittle pages. Unlike the surrounding records, this parchment appeared newer, as though someone had hidden it intentionally. Damien unfolded it carefully. His expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened as he recognized the royal seal stamped across the corner. The document contained an old execution order from years earlier, yet the signature line had been altered so skillfully that only close inspection revealed traces of erased ink beneath the final writing. Damien's heartbeat slowed. He did not recognize the name of the accused, but one thought refused to leave him. If a royal decree could be changed without the king's knowledge once before, then someone inside the palace possessed both the access and the courage to rewrite history itself. Far away, hidden behind the graceful smile she offered every noble she encountered, Lady Seraphine Blackwell watched palace servants whispering about the king's unexpected visit to the archives. For the first time in many years, uncertainty slipped beneath her flawless composure. She had always believed the past was safely buried. She had never imagined the future itself might begin digging it back into the light. The first dream came 3 nights after Damien Ashford discovered the altered royal decree, and unlike every ordinary dream that faded with the morning sun, this one followed him into waking life with unsettling clarity. He stood alone in an endless courtyard beneath a gray sky that seemed suspended between dawn and dusk. Cold wind carried the sound of distant church bells, slow and mournful, while countless white feathers drifted across worn stone like silent snow. Someone stood several yards ahead of him, facing away. A young woman with long golden brown hair moved gently in the breeze, her simple blue-gray dress catching the pale light. He could not see her face, yet an overwhelming sorrow tightened around his heart as though he had spent a lifetime searching for her. He tried to call out, but no words came. Before he could take another step, the woman slowly turned her head. Her lips moved as if speaking directly to him, but the bells grew louder, drowning every sound. Then she smiled. It was not the hopeful smile he had occasionally seen from Rosalie Whitmore across the palace corridors. It was a quiet smile filled with acceptance, the kind worn by someone who had already forgiven a wound that had never been acknowledged. She lifted one hand toward him, and just before their fingertips could meet, she dissolved into countless silver lights carried away by the wind. Damien woke abruptly, his breathing uneven as dawn crept through the windows of his private chambers. He remained seated for several minutes, one hand pressed against his chest where the same familiar emptiness had returned. His wolf paced restlessly inside him, not with anger, but with unmistakable grief. The dream should have disappeared like every other fragment of sleep. Instead, every detail remained vivid. The feathers. The bells. The impossible sadness in Rosalie's eyes. He quietly dressed before sunrise and wandered alone through the palace gardens without informing his guards, hoping the cool morning air would silence the questions gathering inside his mind. Fate had always seemed simple. Duty first. Emotion second. Yet lately every instinct he trusted was leading him somewhere beyond reason. As he crossed the eastern courtyard, he noticed Rosalie kneeling beside an elderly gardener whose basket of seedlings had overturned onto the stone path. She carefully gathered each tiny plant, brushing loose soil from fragile roots before helping the old man arrange them once more. There was nothing extraordinary about the gesture. She expected no praise, accepted no reward, and quietly continued on her way after wishing the gardener a peaceful morning. Damien watched from a distance without revealing himself. A strange certainty settled over him. Every story he had ever heard about Rosalie described her kindness, yet he had never truly witnessed how naturally it shaped every choice she made. She did not become compassionate because someone was watching. She simply was. Meanwhile, Rosalie felt the familiar sensation of unseen eyes resting upon her. In her previous life, she would have searched eagerly for Damien, hoping every unexpected glance meant destiny was finally drawing them together. This time she simply continued walking toward the palace library, her pace calm and steady. She no longer mistook attention for affection. Inside the library, she returned to researching forgotten royal records, searching for any mention of altered decrees or hidden seals that might explain how the execution order in her previous life had been manipulated. As she turned another aging page, a folded map slipped quietly from between 2 dusty volumes. It marked an abandoned records vault beneath the oldest section of the palace, a place she had never discovered in her first life. Before she could study it further, footsteps echoed beyond the shelves. She quickly tucked the map inside her book just as Lady Seraphine Blackwell appeared with her usual graceful smile. "Miss Whitmore," Seraphine said warmly, her voice as elegant as ever. "It seems we keep crossing paths lately." Rosalie returned the greeting politely, but something deep inside her remembered the same smile standing beneath another gray sky while every lie quietly tightened around her future. This time she recognized the danger hidden behind flawless courtesy. Across the room, unnoticed by either woman, Damien entered through the opposite doorway searching for another volume connected to the mysterious royal decree. He froze the moment he saw Rosalie and Seraphine standing together. His wolf stirred with sudden urgency, sending a warning he could neither explain nor ignore. For reasons completely beyond his understanding, every instinct within him whispered the same impossible truth. Keep her away from the woman smiling beside her. The summons arrived at sunrise, carried by a royal messenger whose solemn expression immediately silenced every conversation inside the servants' quarters. Rosalie Whitmore accepted the sealed invitation without surprise. In her first life, this had been the day when quiet suspicion first became public accusation. The details were different now, but the feeling was painfully familiar. She unfolded the parchment and calmly read the words requesting her presence before the Royal Council at noon regarding questions surrounding restricted historical records. She closed her eyes for only a moment before carefully folding the letter again. Fear knocked softly against her heart, but it no longer held the power to rule her choices. The future had already changed too many times to follow the same ending. As the palace filled with whispers, Rosalie walked through its grand corridors with steady grace, wearing the same simple blue-gray dress that had always made her appear almost invisible beside jeweled nobles. Yet something had changed beyond appearances. She no longer lowered her head because she believed she was less worthy than those around her. She simply refused to waste her strength seeking approval from people who had never truly known her. Inside the council chamber, the kingdom's highest officials had already gathered beneath towering stained-glass windows that flooded the room with colored light. Damien Ashford occupied the royal seat with his usual composed authority, though the sleepless nights beneath his calm expression had become impossible for Gideon Mercer to ignore. Lady Seraphine Blackwell stood among the noble advisors, every movement elegant, every smile perfectly measured. When Rosalie entered, dozens of curious eyes turned toward her. The silence felt heavier than any spoken accusation. Seraphine stepped forward with practiced concern. Miss Whitmore, she began gently, certain restricted maps and archival records have recently been removed from protected collections without authorization. Witnesses have placed you inside both the Royal Library and the Old Chapel shortly before these discoveries. We simply wish to understand your intentions. Murmurs spread quietly across the chamber. Rosalie looked around the room without haste. In her previous life, panic had stolen her voice whenever powerful people questioned her. She had believed honesty alone would protect her. This time she understood that truth required courage as well as evidence. I did visit those places, she answered calmly. I searched for forgotten history because forgotten history often explains present mistakes. Several council members exchanged puzzled glances. Seraphine's pleasant smile remained unchanged. Then perhaps you also discovered why confidential royal documents should remain hidden. Before Rosalie could answer, Gideon stepped forward carrying the weathered execution decree Damien had uncovered in the archives. Your Majesty requested that this document be examined by the royal record keeper this morning, he announced. The results have arrived. The elderly record keeper approached with trembling hands and bowed respectfully before the throne. The royal seal is authentic, he said, but the signature beneath it is not entirely original. Someone altered the final authorization after the decree had already been approved. A stunned silence settled across the chamber. Damien slowly rose from his seat, his sharp gray eyes never leaving the parchment. Can the alteration be traced? He asked quietly. The old scholar nodded. Only someone with direct access to the royal seal vault could have completed such precise work. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Seraphine's expression before disappearing behind perfect composure. Rosalie noticed it immediately. So did Damien. The invisible pieces that had haunted him for weeks suddenly shifted into a new pattern. His recurring dream. The mysterious decree. His wolf's relentless warnings whenever Seraphine approached Rosalie. None of it proved guilt. Yet none of it felt like coincidence anymore. Before anyone could speak again, a palace guard hurried into the chamber and knelt before the throne. Your Majesty, he said, struggling to steady his voice, we searched the abandoned records vault beneath the old palace exactly as ordered. We discovered a hidden chest sealed behind a false stone wall. Gideon's eyes widened. Rosalie felt her pulse quicken. Damien descended the steps of the throne without hesitation. "Bring it here," he commanded. Minutes later, 4 guards carried an ancient cedar chest into the center of the council chamber. Dust covered its iron hinges, untouched for years. Across the polished floor, every eye followed as Damien slowly lifted the heavy lid. Inside rested dozens of forgotten royal documents tied together with faded blue ribbon, and lying carefully across the top was a familiar silver moonflower pendant identical to the one now hidden beneath Rosalie's dress. The room fell completely silent. Rosalie's heart stopped for a single breath. Because she knew with absolute certainty that chest had never existed in her first life. The timeline had changed again, and this time it had uncovered a secret that someone had spent years trying to bury. No one inside the royal council chamber spoke as Damien Ashford carefully lifted the silver moonflower pendant from the ancient cedar chest. The polished petals reflected the stained glass light in soft shades of blue and gold, identical to the pendant hidden beneath Rosalie Whitmore's dress. For a long moment, even the restless murmurs beyond the chamber doors faded into complete silence. The elderly royal record keeper stepped forward with visible emotion. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "this emblem belonged to the Moon Keepers, guardians entrusted with preserving royal decrees exactly as they were issued. Every keeper carried one pendant while performing that sacred duty. If 2 pendants now exist, then one of them remained hidden with these documents for a reason." Damien slowly lowered his eyes toward the faded letters resting inside the chest. Gideon Mercer carefully untied the blue ribbon securing the oldest bundle before handing the first parchment to the king. The room watched as Damien unfolded the fragile document. His expression remained controlled, but every line he read deepened the silence surrounding him. It was the original execution decree from the future Rosalie remembered but had never spoken aloud. Unlike the altered copy discovered earlier, this version carried a notation written by the former royal record keeper explaining that the order had been suspended pending further investigation because new evidence had questioned the accusations. Beneath that note rested another page documenting that the suspension had later disappeared from the official archives without authorization. Someone had deliberately erased the king's revised decision before replacing it with a forged final order. Damien's hands remained steady, yet something inside him quietly shattered. Without warning, another fragment of the impossible dream returned. Gray skies. Church bells. White feathers drifting through cold air. Rosalie standing alone with quiet sadness in her eyes. This time one sentence reached him clearly. "You never knew." The words echoed through his heart with unbearable weight. His wolf fell completely silent, not because its grief had ended, but because it had finally recognized what it had been mourning all along. Damien slowly looked toward Rosalie. She met his gaze calmly, without resentment or expectation. She had already released the future that once depended upon his choices. That peaceful distance hurt more deeply than any accusation ever could. Before anyone else could speak, Lady Seraphine Blackwell stepped forward, her elegant composure beginning to fracture. She insisted the hidden records proved nothing and suggested that unknown conspirators had manipulated the archives over many years. But the royal record keeper quietly produced one final ledger from the chest. It documented every official entrusted with access to the royal seal vault during the period when the decrees had been altered. Only 3 names appeared. 2 belonged to servants who had passed away years earlier. The third belonged to Lady Seraphine Blackwell, who had served as temporary keeper of royal correspondence during the transition between record keepers. The chamber fell silent once more. Seraphine closed her eyes briefly before lowering her head. She offered no further denial. The truth no longer required raised voices. It stood plainly within the forgotten records she had believed would never be found. Damien drew a slow breath before addressing the council. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable conviction. "From this day forward, every royal decree shall require independent preservation by the Moon Keepers, and no order affecting the life or freedom of any citizen shall ever be altered without public record and witness. Let this kingdom remember that justice cannot survive where truth is hidden." The council unanimously accepted the decree. As officials quietly escorted Seraphine away to face lawful judgment under the kingdom's established process, Damien descended from the throne and stopped several feet before Rosalie. He did not reach for her hand. He did not speak of destiny or forgotten bonds. Instead, before the entire court, the Alpha King bowed his head. "I cannot ask forgiveness for wounds I failed to see," he said softly. "I can only promise that I will spend every day ensuring no one under my protection is ever silenced the way you were." Rosalie listened in thoughtful silence. Then she touched the moonflower pendant resting beneath her dress before offering him a gentle smile that carried neither bitterness nor surrender. "A better kingdom is the apology that matters most," she replied. "The rest belongs to tomorrow." Damien nodded without asking for anything more. Outside the palace, sunlight poured across the capital as ordinary people continued their daily lives, unaware that history had quietly changed forever within the council chamber. Rosalie stepped through the great palace doors with peaceful confidence, no longer guided by a bond she had lost, but by the life she had finally chosen for herself. And for the first time, the future waiting beyond the horizon belonged to no prophecy, no ancient promise, and no king alone. It belonged to hope freely given, courage freely chosen, and a woman who had learned that her greatest destiny began the moment she believed she was already enough.